Hey there, this is Alexis Knight. Welcome to True Crime, the Court of Public Opinion. I'm your host, guiding you through cases that have moved through the courts and reached a conclusion, but left the public divided. These are not your typical cut and dried cases. These are the ones where the facts may be clear, but the truth? Well, that's another story. Now imagine this. You are living with a severe mental illness. Day in and day out, your mind is your greatest struggle. One day you make a mistake, a crime, and suddenly you're thrown into jail. But instead of help, instead of understanding, you are left in isolation, where your mental condition only gets worse. What would you do? How would that feel? This is what happened to Derrick Clay, a man struggling with schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, whose story raises the question we're going to be exploring today. Was he mad in the grip of mental illness? Or was he bad, making conscious choices that led to his crimes? We're going to dive into this complex case where the lines between mental illness and criminal behavior blur. So stay with me. By the end of this episode, you are going to have the chance to decide for yourself. Where does society draw the line between treatment and punishment? All right, let's get into it. Now that you've been able to try to imagine yourself in Derrick Clay's shoes, let's dive deeper into this case, which forces us to confront the intersections of mental illness and criminal justice. Derrick Clay, a man who was diagnosed with schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. He was arrested in Colorado for a minor crime, shoplifting. But what followed was a downward spiral that led him into a much darker place. Clay's mental health issues were well documented. His family knew about his condition, and in many cases, so did local authorities. But when he was arrested in March of 2018, the system that was supposed to help people like Clay failed him. Instead of being diverted to a mental health facility where he could receive treatment, Clay was sent to the El Paso County Jail. And in jail, his mental condition rapidly deteriorated. And this is not surprising. Jails are often ill-equipped to handle inmates with complex mental health needs, leaving them to struggle in an environment that can make their conditions worse. Within days of his arrest, Clay allegedly struck a police officer, an incident that led him being placed into solitary confinement. This is a practice that has been shown to exacerbate mental illness. This is something we already know. Isolated and untreated, Clay's behavior worsened. And again, we know this will happen. Another altercation with guards resulted in additional charges, and this time now, his jail time stretched from days to months, as he awaited a competency evaluation to determine if he was even fit enough to stand trial. Was he fit enough to stand isolation? Well, nobody asked that. At the heart of this case lies the question, was Clay acting out because of his mental illness? Or did his criminal actions reflect his character? Critics argue that the system failed to step in early enough to provide him with the necessary help before his behavior spiraled out of control. Others pointed out that while mental illness can affect behavior, it doesn't absolve someone of responsibility for their actions. Should Clay be held accountable for his violence against officers, even though he was clearly in a deteriorated mental state at the time? That was the question, and this brings us to a critical issue in the criminal justice system. Are jails meant for individuals like Clay? People who may need serious psychiatric treatment rather than confinement? And more importantly, at what point do we intervene to help someone before their situation turns from bad to worse? So, as Derrick Clay's time in jail dragged on, it became more clear that the system was not equipped to handle someone with his level of mental illness. The months he spent waiting for a competency evaluation, months, Months? That's a long time. And his whole entire situation only worsened. His condition got worse. His mother, desperate to get him transferred to a state hospital for proper treatment, made repeated attempts to reach out to government agencies and disability advocates, but the wait times for mentally ill defendants to be transferred to mental health facilities were long and far beyond the legal limits set by the state laws, that's for sure. But that's still what's happening. Colorado, like many states, has struggled with its mental health system. The demand for inpatient psychiatric beds far outpaces supply, meaning that individuals like Clay, who should have been receiving treatment, instead languished in jail cells. In Clay's case, the delays and lack of intervention made a bad situation worse. As his mental health declined, his behavior became more erratic, leading to additional charges and further isolation within the jail system. And this vicious cycle just continued. Clay's untreated mental illness caused him to lash out, and those actions only resulted in more penalties and punishments. And this leads us to the critical issue at the heart of this case. How do we deal with mentally ill individuals who commit crimes? On the one hand, Clay did engage in violent behavior. He struck officers on multiple occasions. Behavior that's not acceptable regardless of his mental state. On the other hand, it's very clear that his mental state was a major factor in his actions. He was not receiving any psychiatric care, and he desperately needed it, and the conditions in jail only pushed him further into a mental health crisis. Critics of the system argue that there should be more steps in place to divert mentally ill individuals away from jails and into treatment facilities before their condition worsens. You're trying to evaluate someone to see if they're okay to stand trial, yet you sort of grind it all in, leaving them in jail in isolation, creating a worse experience for them, making them worse, all before they go to that competency hearing. And it kind of doesn't even match what they're trying to do, but this is what we're stuck with. Where is the line between someone who is mentally ill and someone who is dangerous? This is a never-ending question, and we talk about it a lot here. At what point should society step in to help? And when should individuals be held fully accountable for their actions, regardless of their mental state? This case pushes us to confront the difficult balance between compassion for mental illness and the need for accountability. Derrick Clay's story is not just about his actions. It's about a system that may have missed crucial opportunities to provide Derrick with the help he needed before it was too late. At the heart of Derrick's case lies the difficult question: how should society handle individuals who suffer from severe mental illness, but yet engage in violent criminal behavior? So you're mentally having hardships and you engage in criminal behavior. Was Clay a man in the grip of a mental health crisis when he was doing these things, or was his violent behavior something that requires accountability? It doesn't matter what his diagnosis is. And more broadly, where do we draw the line between treating mental illness and punishing criminal actions? Again, it's a never-ending question. Let's go back to the scene. Imagine you're someone close to Derrick Clay. You've known about his struggles with schizophrenia and bipolar disorder for years. You've watched him navigate a fragile existence, balanced by periods of stability when he's on meds and under medical care, followed by times when he spirals out of control, when the treatment stops and the paranoia and confusion take over, and you see him slip into a mental world far from reality. Now, on one of those bad days, he gets arrested. A small crime, something like shoplifting, and it lands him in jail. Now, in this moment, you're torn. On the one hand, yes, he broke the law, but on the other hand, you know this isn't just bad behavior. He needs help, not punishment. The system, however, doesn't see it that way. And instead of getting treatment, he's locked into a cell and he's left to deteriorate further. What could have been a manageable situation begins to spiral out of control. And that's exactly what happened. Clay, suffering from untreated schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, gets placed in jail. In a jail environment that is not designed to care for someone with such severe mental needs. His behavior, fueled by his deteriorating condition, becomes increasingly erratic. He struck officers, leading to further charges, and was placed in solitary confinement, which only exacerbated his illness. And this raises the central question: should we view Clay's actions as a product of his mental illness? Or do we hold him fully accountable for his violence? This is not an easy dilemma. On one hand, it's very clear that Clay's mental state was a major factor in his behavior. His untreated mental illness played a significant role in his actions. And without proper care, it's not surprising that his condition would worsen in jail. But on the other hand, violence is just violence, and the officers he struck, they were injured in the line of duty. Should Clay be held accountable for these actions, even though he was in a mentally deteriorated state? This case also raises questions about how the system handles individuals with mental illness in general. Was jail the right place for Derrick Clay? Or should he have been placed, diverted to a mental health facility right from the beginning? Critics argue that placing mentally ill individuals in jail only worsens their conditions and increases the likelihood for more violence. But there's another side to this argument, because some believe that regardless of his mental state, Clay posed a danger to those around him, and jail was the only option to protect both him and society. And so if you notice here, there are only two options. You are mentally ill and you get to go sit over here and talk to some doctors, and no, you're violent, and so you need to go over here and sit with all the other violent people. If you are mentally ill, suffering from a condition you cannot control, and yet you are violent, is there a third place possibly that these people could go? Think about it. This case, like many others, it forces us to confront a difficult reality, because the criminal justice system is not always equipped to handle mental illness. And for people like Derrick, the system seems to skip an important step: the opportunity to receive help before being thrown into jail. The question becomes, where's the intervention? Where is that moment when someone looks at a person like Clay and says, hey, this guy needs care, he needs psychiatric help, not isolation and punishment? It's clear that Clay's condition played a significant role in his actions, but does that absolve him of his responsibility? On one hand, his actions, he struck officers, he lashed out. They're not behaviors we can overlook. Even if they're driven by his mental illness, the fact remains that people were harmed as a result of this. That's a fact. And in cases like these where mental illness leads to violence, society's often left grappling with that balance between treatment and accountability. And it's nice when it's not you, right? It's not your family. It's not happening to you. It's a lot easier to try to think about this. And that's why I try to bring it home. What if it was someone you cared about? What if it was you? How do we protect both the individual struggling with mental illness and the public at large? Should we view Clay's behavior as a consequence of a broken system that failed to provide him with the help he needed? Or do we hold him responsible for the harm he caused, regardless of his mental state? And then another question that we have to consider is whether the system even had the resources to help Clay. Colorado, like so many other states, they face a shortage of inpatient psychiatric care. The wait lists for treatment like this can be months long. And even when that spot becomes available, it's often too late for individuals like Clay, whose conditions have worsened in the meantime. And who caused that? What caused that? Critics argue that the lack of available mental health care is one of the reasons why people like Clay end up in jail instead of receiving the treatment they need. But others contend that even with better mental health care, Clay's behavior, which was violent, erratic, and dangerous, could have still posed a threat to society. And what about the responsibility of the criminal justice system itself? Should the courts and the police and the jails bear some responsibility here for recognizing when an individual like Clay is in need of psychiatric intervention? Or is their role solely to enforce the law and punish those who break it? In this case, it seems the system failed to take Clay's mental illness into account early on, instead treating him as any other criminal. But the question still remains, how much leniency should the system give to someone whose behavior is driven by mental illness? Let's take a look at some of the facts here. What's going on with Derrick Clay? His life was a complicated one, marked by years of struggling with schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. His family had been aware of his mental health conditions for years, but it wasn't until 2018 that things took a drastic turn for the worse. Clay, in a deteriorating mental state, was arrested for shoplifting in El Paso County, Colorado, south. For many, shoplifting might seem like a minor crime, but for someone in Clay's condition, it marked the beginning of a much deeper spiral. Upon his arrest, Clay gets taken to the El Paso County Jail. This seems pretty familiar, right? It seems routine. We see this happen. A facility in El Paso that's not designed to provide the level of care required for someone with a severe mental illness. It's in El Paso County, and it's a jail for people that break the law. That's it. Instead of being sent to a psychiatric facility where he could receive treatment, he was placed in a regular jail environment. And this decision would prove to be a critical mistake. Without access to the proper care, Clay's mental health rapidly worsened. Within days of being incarcerated, Clay's behavior became erratic and violent. He allegedly struck a corrections officer during a routine cell check. In response, jail authorities placed him in solitary confinement, a practice known to exacerbate the symptoms of mental illness. May be okay for someone who doesn't have these conditions, but for someone like Clay, isolation only deepened his sense of paranoia and confusion, and it pushed him further into a mental health crisis. Over the following weeks, Clay's behavior continued to deteriorate. Another incident occurred in which Clay reportedly struck a second officer, leading to more charges. What began as a relatively minor offense here, guys, shoplifting, is now spiraling into something much more serious. The assault charges, added additional layers of complexity to Clay's case, as the legal system now had to contend with the question of how to handle a mentally ill individual who had engaged in violent behavior while incarcerated. All the while, there's Clay's family. They're advocating for him outside of jail. His mother, aware of the seriousness of her son's mental health condition, made repeated attempts to get him transferred to a state hospital where he could get the care he needed. But the system was slow to respond. In Colorado, like many states, the availability of inpatient psychiatric care is limited, and individuals often face long wait times before being admitted to a treatment facility. And in the meantime, for Clay, he just stayed in jail. His condition got worse with every passing day. As Derrick's time in jail continued, his mental health issues became even more pronounced. With no psychiatric treatment available to him, the jail environment only intensified his symptoms. Inmates and officers alike noticed Clay's increasingly erratic behavior. He was often confused and paranoid and prone to violent outbursts. But instead of being transferred to a mental health facility for evaluation or treatment, Clay was kept in solitary confinement, where the lack of social interaction further exacerbated his condition. The jail staff, while trained in basic procedures, they're not equipped to manage someone with severe mental illness. And with Colorado's psychiatric facilities overwhelmed, the wait for an open bed was far too long. Clay's family, especially his mother, worked tirelessly to try to get him the help he needed. She reached out to disability advocates, government agencies, and she even tried calling the jail directly, contacting them. But progress was just too slow. Each day that Clay spent in jail was another day that his untreated mental illness led to worsening behavior and deeper isolation. Eventually, Clay's legal situation began to spiral out of control. His initial charge of shoplifting is a relatively minor crime. This has now turned into multiple felony charges due to the assaults on the officers. The legal system, which was supposed to evaluate his mental state, seemed more focused on adding charges than providing treatment. And this left Clay in a cycle of worsening behavior, increased legal penalties, and no psychiatric care in sight. And a question here. So he is responsible for the shoplifting and then his defensive, violent behavior. Where does that fall with you guys? If his mental state has him paranoid, and once someone realizes that, would you still want to prosecute this person for assault? You kind of might want to, but would you? Would you really? Ask yourself. By the time the competency evaluation that he deserved to have finally got ordered to determine whether Clay was fit to stand trial, during this time, Clay had been sitting in solitary confinement, his mental health deteriorating further with each passing day. The evaluation eventually confirmed what his family already knew. He was not competent to stand trial. His mental illness was just too severe for him to understand the charges against him or even participate in his own defense. But even with this evaluation, the process of getting Clay transferred to a state hospital for treatment was riddled with delays. In many ways, Clay's case is a stark example of the flaws in the criminal justice system when it comes to handling individuals with severe mental health issues. Instead of being diverted to treatment early on, Clay was left to languish in a system that was not equipped to handle his needs. So, of course, and as his condition worsened, the legal questions became even more severe, trapping him in a vicious cycle of incarceration and untreated mental illness. Now, as Clay's case progressed, the delays in providing him with proper psychiatric care became more than just a bureaucratic issue. They became a matter of Clay's overall mental and physical well-being. It's getting even more serious for Clay. The longer he stayed in solitary confinement without any treatment, the worse his condition grew. Who's responsible for that? The jail's response to his outbursts was to keep him further isolated, which only made him worse. It deepened his paranoia and sense of fear. This part of the case raises an important point about the impact of solitary confinement on individuals with mental illness. For a person like Clay, already battling schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, isolation was not just a punishment. It becomes a form of psychological torture that worsened his already fragile state. And experts in the field of mental health have long argued that solitary confinement is detrimental to anyone's mental well-being, not to mention individuals with severe mental health conditions. It can push them into an irreparable mental decline. And again, who is responsible for that? Since we're talking about taking accountability. Now, during this time, I talked about Clay's family, but they've continued to push for him to be transferred. They're still trying to get it done. They knew that Clay needed more than just medication. He needed therapeutic intervention. He needed counseling and a structured environment that could help stabilize him. But the process of transferring him to such a facility, it just dragged on, hindered by wait lists and bureaucratic red tape. The competency evaluation, when it was finally conducted, concluded that Clay was not mentally fit to stand trial. Wow. This should have been a turning point in his case. However, even with this diagnosis, getting Clay out of the jail system and into the care of a psychiatric facility was not a straightforward process. The state's mental health system was overwhelmed, and Clay became another case in the long backlog of individuals waiting for beds in psychiatric facilities. The implications of this case, they go beyond Clay's individual experience. His story shines a light on the broader issue within the criminal justice system: the lack of adequate mental health resources and the consequences of failing to intervene early enough. By the time Clay's family was able to secure his transfer to a state hospital, the damage had already been done. The months he spent in jail and isolation left him deeply affected, and his condition had worsened significantly. Though the transfer finally provided him with the care he needed, the question remained, could all of this have been prevented? But okay, so now Clay is in treatment. And by the time he is getting treatment at the state hospital, it's very clear that the events of his time in jail had a lasting impact. And it wasn't just on him, it was on his family, the legal system, and everyone involved in this case. The legal question that now remained was how the courts would handle Clay's charges of assault on the officers during his incarceration. Was he responsible for these actions, or were they just a result of his untreated mental illness, exacerbated by the conditions of his confinement? Now, from a legal perspective, this is not easy to answer, okay? On one side, the officers who were attacked, they have every right to feel protected in their workplace, and the assaults Clay committed cannot simply be brushed aside. However, the other side of the argument is equally as compelling. How much responsibility can we place on an individual whose mental health condition was spiraling out of control, worsened by the very system that was supposed to safeguard him? Would these officers even have any charges to bring if he had gotten the care he needed, Derrick? And who should they be upset about for that, Derrick? Think about it. During Clay's time at the hospital, doctors worked to stabilize his condition, and with proper medication and therapeutic intervention, his behavior did improve. The episodes of violence subsided. This drastic change in behavior raised even more questions. Had he received this care earlier? Again, would any of this have happened? And this is the heart of the issue for advocates that argue that Clay's case highlights a fundamental failure in criminal justice. But then there's still the legal side. The court still had to determine whether Clay was fit to face the charges related to his violent outbursts while incarcerated. His competency to stand trial was once again brought into question, and the legal proceedings slowed as both sides worked to build their cases. With Derrick Clay's mental health now stabilized under treatment, the legal team shifted the focus toward the next critical question. Could Clay's current state of mind offer a pathway to rehabilitation, or should the legal consequences for his earlier actions still stand? The defense argued that Clay's treatment had transformed him into a different person than the one who committed the original acts in jail. Their goal was to show that had Clay received proper psychiatric care from the beginning, none of the violent acts would even have occurred. The defense's strategy wasn't just to explain Clay's behavior as a product of untreated mental illness, but to make the case for diversion from the criminal justice system entirely. They argued that Derrick Clay's situation highlighted the systemic failure to address mental health crises before they escalate into legal problems. By the time Clay was charged with multiple felonies, his untreated schizophrenia and bipolar disorder had reached a crisis point, exacerbated by his time in solitary confinement. When people hear this person has multiple felonies, often something dangerous comes to mind, right? When you hear felony, do you think this person is suffering from mental illness? Well, as the arguments unfolded in court, the defense continued to emphasize that Clay's violent actions were symptoms of his untreated mental illness, and they pushed for a focus on rehabilitation rather than punishment. They argued that placing Clay in a mental health facility had already shown positive results, and further punitive measures would only set him back. The defense's ultimate goal was to secure a sentence that prioritized ongoing treatment rather than jail time, which they argued would only lead to a relapse of his mental health issues. The defense team made a case for diversion, meaning Clay would continue receiving psychiatric care rather than facing additional jail time. They highlighted the importance of treatment for individuals like Clay whose actions, while harmful, were directly related to a severe and untreated mental health condition. The defense also brought attention to the failures in the system that led to Clay's decline in the first place, arguing that the state bore some responsibility for not providing the care he needed when he was first incarcerated. But the prosecution continued to drive home the point that justice for the assaulted officers must be served. They acknowledged the improvements Clay had made under psychiatric care, but insisted the legal consequences of his actions should still stand. They framed their argument around public safety, raising concerns that if Clay were not held accountable for the assaults, it could set a dangerous precedent. They argued that allowing mental illness to act as a complete shield from legal consequences could open the door for similar cases where individuals avoid punishment for violent actions. They also pointed out that Clay's mental health improvements were recent and that there was no guarantee he wouldn't pose a risk again if he were released without any form of punishment. They pressed for a sentence that reflected both the seriousness of his actions and the need to balance treatment with accountability. In their view, a punishment that included some form of incarceration, along with continued psychiatric care, was the best way to ensure both justice and Clay's safety moving forward. As the case neared its conclusion, both sides made compelling arguments for how Clay's future should be handled. The defense sought a path of rehabilitation, while the prosecution pushed for accountability and public safety. It was now up to the judge to determine the balance between these two competing priorities. Derrick Clay's case sparked heated debate about the intersection of mental illness and criminal accountability. Many argued that Clay's violent actions were the result of his untreated schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, which were worsened by his time in solitary confinement. Critics of the system pointed out that had Clay received proper psychiatric care from the start, the assaults might never have occurred. Mental health advocates used the case to highlight how the criminal justice system often fails individuals with severe mental health conditions, treating them as criminals rather than patients. At the core of the controversy was whether Clay should be held accountable for his actions during a mental health crisis. Some argued that his behavior, while harmful, was not driven by malice, but by a lack of treatment and appropriate care. They questioned whether it was just to punish someone whose violent outbursts were the direct result of a systemic failure to address his needs. On the other side of the debate, many believed that regardless of Clay's mental state, the violence he inflicted on the officers should not be excused. They felt that failing to hold him accountable would set a dangerous precedent, where mental illness could be used as a blanket defense for violent actions. Public safety, in their view, had to remain a priority. Set that example. And allowing Clay to escape legal consequences would undermine that. This controversy also raised broader questions about the role of jails in handling mental illness. With psychiatric facilities often at capacity, jails have become de facto mental health centers for those who have not received care. This case brought to light the inadequacies of that system and whether incarceration is ever an appropriate response for individuals suffering from severe mental health conditions. In the end, the debate was not just about Derrick Clay. It was about the system itself. Whether it had failed him by not intervening earlier, and whether it continues to fail others like him who are caught in the cycle of mental illness and criminal behavior. Clay's case highlighted the tension between the need for treatment and the demand for justice, raising critical questions about how society should respond to individuals with mental illness who engage in violence. Okay, now that we have examined both sides of this case for Derrick Clay, the arguments for mental health treatment, and the call for legal accountability, it is time to ask, what do you think? Was this a man who, in the midst of a mental health crisis, was let down by a system designed to punish rather than help? Or should Derrick Clay, despite his diagnosis, be held responsible for his violent actions, as the victims of his assaults deserve justice? Ultimately, this decision is complicated. We have seen how the system failed to provide Clay with the care he needed, but we've also seen the consequences of his violent actions. But in the end, what did happen to Derrick Clay? Well, initially, Derrick Clay faced felony charges for assaulting a paramedic during a mental health crisis. This incident occurred after a series of other troubling events, culminating in his arrest. However, as the case progressed and his mental health issues were considered, the felony charge was ultimately reduced to a misdemeanor, and this reduction reflected the understanding of his mental illness and the context of his actions, highlighting the complexities surrounding his legal situation. And that's what happened to Derrick. But now, again, I ask you, what do you think? What's your decision? Punishment or rehabilitation? What is missing in our system? Think about it. Thank you for joining me on another case in True Crime, the Court of Public Opinion. The case of Derrick Clay forces us to confront some difficult questions about the balance between mental health and criminal responsibility. Was justice served? Did the system fail? The debate continues, but for now, it's up to you to decide where you stand. Stay safe out there, guys. Stay out of trouble. Stay aware. And until next time, this is Alexis Knight.